Starting from page 55 in Zoe Schlager, The Light Eaters. I'm just going to start with the first full paragraph. Communication is another of many basic life processes with no agreed upon scientific definition. For most of us, communication is about something we can express in order to tell another being something they need to know. It suggests a complicated form of intentionality, forethought, and an awareness of cause and effect. That may be so, but life began to communicate, depending on how you define it, prior to the advent of more complex existence. It began with the first multicellular organism at least 600 million years ago. For life to open to the possibility of multicellularity, individual cells had to coordinate among themselves. Up to that point, all life was single-celled. These autonomous little selves were adrift in the ancient sea, each making their way on their own. For more complex forms to emerge, individual cells had to share information with each other. To this day, in order to coalesce into a body, each cell in an organism must know who it is and what it does. Cells understand themselves by way of other cells. In a chain of 3 cells, for example, the third cell knows it is third, and thus endowed with a special task reserved for third cells because of its awareness of the presence of cell 1 and cell 2. That is the nature of a self-organizing system, a cohesive body. But how that cell knows it is third remains a mystery. We know that information must be passed to it by its collaborator cells. This communication, whatever it is, begins with the very first cell division, when 1 cell becomes 2 and then 4, which is the strategy every multi-celled organism uses to grow. The medium of that information, electrical, chemical, some other form, is unknown. The nature of the communication also remains a major question in animal embryology. We'd like to know how a sperm and an egg self-organize to make us. Plant cells do this too. In the most liberal use of the term, they talk to each other. In this way, each cell understands what it is for, or put another way, who they are. Barbara McClintock, the Nobel-winning geneticist who discovered genes could shift their positions in corn, called this cellular awareness the knowledge the cell has of itself. When cells talk, big things happen. When cells talk, big things happen. All plant life proceeds from these foundational interactions. In 2017, a researcher at the University of Birmingham identified the presence of a decision-making center within dormant seeds that integrated information and decided when the plant should emerge. This center is made up of a cluster of cells located at the tip of the seed's embryonic root. The cells communicate to each other about the abundance of 2 hormones in the seed, 1 hormone that promotes dormancy and 1 promotes germination. The cells integrate information about the changing temperature of the soil around them to regulate each hormone. Apologies, my cat is munching on something that I had to check on. But just wanted to check on her. In this way, the cluster of cells decides when to flip the switch and emerge into the world. The timing of the decision to emerge is critical. This risky decision is made more accurate by relying on the cumulative responses of multiple cells. By making a decision based on 2 opposing variables, the relative abundance of 2 hormones, both of which are sensitive to temperature changes, the plant has a higher chance of making a good choice in a fluctuating world. This is, the researchers noted, a method of cell-to-cell communication analogous to certain structures in the human brain. Our brains also pass antagonistic hormones back and forth between cells to improve our decision-making in a fluctuating world. Rather than making the decision to move a muscle based on a single input, The brain makes its decision by accumulating hormonal information from separate cells and weeding out irrelevant information in the process. This is at its heart a case of cells in communication. Through the chatter of their cells, plants self-organize systems, but that whole plants might be considered to communicate intentionally with each other. That communication could extend beyond one plant to another. It is a relatively new and still controversial concept in botany. One key problem includes the whole thing towards debate. There is no agreed upon definition for what counts as communication. Not even in animals. Does a signal need to be sent purposefully? Does it need to provoke a response in the receiver? Much as consciousness and intelligence have no settled definition, communication slip-slides between realms of philosophy and science, finding secure footing in neither. To proceed with a sense of clarity, I'll define the communication as happening when a signal is sent, received, and causes a response. You'll notice I didn't say when a signal is intentionally sent. Intentionality is more difficult to discern, in part because we don't know what it's like to be a plant. Intention poses the hardest of problems because it could not be directly discovered. We can only build knowledge around the problem of intention, drawing our perimeter close to it and hope that in encircling it, its form might begin to take a shape we can understand. Yet at first, just the mere idea that plants could have any information to convey to each other was absent from a scientific map. All Rhodes knew was that a plague began and then stopped. In the spring of 1977, the experimental forest of the University of Washington was in its third consecutive spring of a sustained and gruesome tent caterpillar attack. Red adlers and Sitka willows, usually able to withstand the nuisance of a few months' tendency by these web-weaving leaf eaters, were succumbing by the hundreds. The caterpillars were almost completely defoliating them, which is to say they were visiting a famine upon them. A tree without leaves to photosynthesize in the growing season cannot make sugar and effectively starves to death. But the following spring, in 1978, the balance of power seemed to shift. The tent caterpillars were dying now. Their populations crashed. Few caterpillar eggs appeared on the remaining tree leaves, where the previous spring they were everywhere. Eggs that did show up didn't tend to hatch. By the spring of 1979, the caterpillars had vanished entirely. The trees stopped dying. Their leaves were full and productive. The fortunes of each party had reversed. As every ecologist knows, nothing changes in an ecosystem without a reason. Something drove that shift. Rhodes, who had a PhD in both organic chemistry and zoology, began looking for an explanation. For years, he'd been cultivating a provocative idea without much support from his colleagues. He thought plants might develop resistance to certain threats after being exposed to them, much as the animal immune system builds up antibodies to a disease the animal has already encountered. He'd noticed that insects would often start to eat a plant and then eventually stop, despite there being plenty of good leaves left to eat. Again, nothing occurs in nature without cause. Something made the insects stop. Something made the insects stop. Might the plant be clocking the invasion, or clocking, excuse me. Might the plant be clocking the invasion and mounting a sort of immune response to it? That would explain the lag. Plants operate on a slower time scale than insects, so it made sense that they'd react more slowly too. His lab tests bore this out. He saw that after leaves had been enduring a swarm of munching caterpillars for a while, their chemistry changed. The plant would alter the contents of its leaves to be less nutritious. The idea that a plant could actively defend itself, though, was heretical to the whole premise of how scientists thought plants worked. Plants were not supposed to be that active or have such dramatic and strategic reactions. Rhodes found few supporters for his hypothesis. But the tent caterpillar invasion on university grounds provided the perfect scenario to study his theory in the real world. The besieged trees did eventually change the composition of their leaves, sickening the caterpillars, who would eventually die of starvation through diarrhea. He was pleased. His theory checked out. But he also noticed something else. Even the leaves of faraway trees, which the caterpillars had not yet touched, changed their composition too. They'd been warned, and somehow the warning had traveled a long distance. Plants are tremendous at chemical synthesis, he knew, and certain plant chemicals drift on the air. Everyone already knew that ripening fruit produced airborne ethylene, for example, which prompts nearby fruit to ripen too. The commercial fruit industry used it to ripen warehouses full of unripe bananas just in time for sale, making the global trade of an otherwise fast-rotting fruit possible. It wasn't unreasonable to imagine that plant chemicals containing other information, say that the forest was under attack, might drift through the air too. Rhodes presented his hypothesis at conferences. The story of the talking trees spread, whispered from botanist to botanist like arboreal gossip. Could it be true? But none of his peers were willing to take the risk of publishing something so outlandish. The discovery ended up buried in an obscure volume. Rhodes spent the next few years performing the usual academic duties. He taught and guest lectured, all while being bludgeoned by colleagues in journals and at conferences. He turned more and more towards his role as a mentor, finding considerably more openness in students and new professors, perhaps because they had not yet been blinded by institutional conservationism. Rhodes began to exchange letters with Rick Carbon, a newly minted entomology professor who was interested in his idea of induced resistance. Induced resistance, the phenomenon in which a plant chewed by insects would alter its chemistry and be less likely to be munched on later. Carbon thought the unusual view of plants at the whims of their environment couldn't be right. He'd come up with studying some cicadas, which lay their eggs in trees. When the larvae hatch, they drop to the ground, burrowed into the tree's roots, and stay there for 17 years, sucking its sap. To the tree, it's a huge nuisance to have all that nutrition leak out of its lower parts before reaching its upper ones. To the tree, it's a huge nuisance to have all that nutrition leak out of its lower parts before reaching its upper ones. You come up studying cicadas, which lay their eggs in trees. When the larvae hatch, they drop to the ground, burrow into the tree's roots, and stay there for 17 years, sucking the sap. As a young scientist, Carbon read a paper by pioneering cicada researcher Joanne White, who discovered that some trees were able to locate the place on their branch where the cicada eggs set and grow a callus around them, suffocating them to death before they could hatch. Ophelia. Carbon, like Rhodes, thought that plants couldn't possibly be passive. Carbon invited Rhodes to speak to his graduate class. Carbon invited Rhodes to speak to his graduate class. After that, they stayed in touch. Ophelia. I don't know if you can hear her. I don't know if you can. After that, they stayed in touch. Rhodes read Carbon's manuscripts and commented on his grant proposals, but Rhodes' own life was crumbling around him. The reprimands continued. He had trouble replicating his own study. He tried for 2 years. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. After a pattern of rejection, Rhodes gave up applying to grants. Rhodes gave up applying to grants. The researcher's equivalent to giving up eating. Oh, she is in there having a smorgasbord. I don't know. If Finally, he left the world of scientific discovery. He took a job teaching organic chemistry at a community college and opened up a motel on the Pacific coast. He took a yeah. He was diagnosed with terminal cancer in the 1990s and died in 2002. Yeah, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer in the 1990s and died in 2002. With his work, he'd arrived at the right place, only it was the wrong time. But all the while, the tide, at least for others, was slowly turning. 6 months after Rhodes published his paper, Ian Baldwin and Jack Schultz, then young researchers at Dartmouth College, published a very similar finding. It isn't always clear why fortune favors some and not others in the arc of scientific discovery. Excuse me, I misread that. It isn't always clear why fortune favors some and not others in the arc of scientific history. In this case, it's likely a combination of luck and study design. Their work was done in the safety of a lab. The outdoors are a messy place to do science. Lab work is clean, controlled, specific. Baldwin and Schultz placed pairs of sugar sample seedlings inside the sterility of a growth chamber. The seedlings shared the same air but didn't touch. Then the researchers ripped the leaves of one and measured the response in the other. Within 36 hours, the untouched maple seedling loaded up its leaves with tannin. In other words, despite not experiencing damage itself, the untouched maple went to work making itself extremely unpalatable. Baldwin and Schultz noted that they were second in line to notice this phenomenon, acknowledging Rhodes in their paper. Yeah, noted that they were second in line to notice this phenomenon, acknowledging Rhodes in their paper. They even went so far as to use the word communication in their work. Rhodes never used the C word, choosing to dance around it. The mainstream press understandably seized on the word, printing headlines about talking trees in national newspapers. They were generally chastised by peers for using such human language for plants. But in contrast to Rhodes, to say their career recovered would be an understatement. To say their careers recovered would be an understatement. Today, Baldwin is one of the most successful and prolific individuals working on plant behavior. He has a large team of graduate students and postdocs working out how tobacco plants, in effect, communicate, defend themselves, and choose Which other tobacco plants to have sex with? Jack Schultz spent decades as a major contributor to the field of communication between plants and insects, and was known to say that the scent of cut grass is the chemical equivalent of a plant's scream. Both say they were inspired by roads. I don't know if you've ever cooked lobster, a live lobster, just dropped it into a boiling hot vat of water. But you can audibly hear this really high-pitched squealing, or what sounds like screaming. In all reality, I think scientists like to believe that it is the air leaving the shell, some type of air leaving the shell at a high rate because of the temperature change. But then again, maybe it's the screams of a lobster being tortured. We may never know. But if you like exoskeletal life forms, and if you cared about the amount of blatant pain that you were causing a living form of life, it's something to think about. A little later in that chapter, they talk about how if you have a plant that lives in a pot, are you effectively cutting it off from communication from its counterparts? Can it no longer detect the nutrients or the communication rooted systems that might actually be relaying, like a relay race, this information back and forth? The warnings, the pleasure, the pain, the necessity to evolve faster, slower. They talk about that. We'll get there. But meditating on the effect of temperature change was one of the things that I think they said nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, I believe it was. Um, Excuse me if I'm misquoting. I don't think it's so important for me to go back and find that portion. I think the understanding of who you are, what you are, and why you are. It's that kind of third place placement, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not grounded. It doesn't really mean that you're not grounded. It means that you've got a peripheral view, or you've had your sight on a specific vision, which is communication. And that may or may not be recognized. Hopefully, it is not a crash like what they were talking about, a clashing of ideologies that cannot ever kind of bend to meet one another halfway. So halfway between up and down is kind of sideways, and I guess that's the way this kind of came out. I don't know. We'll put it in the I'll just take it in the upright. The necessity for water is just as important as light. I was realizing the other day, light is extremely important when looking for planets outside of our own. It's called the habitable zone. How far or close planets reside to a light source of energy like the sun or any kind of star for that matter. However, water is what we look for first and foremost. It doesn't matter if you're in the habitable zone if there is no water. If that's if there is no water, there is no life possible. There's about 80% of our composition as humans, and also a very integral part of photosynthesis. I don't think that's a secret. Dehydration of a caterpillar by diarrhea means that they've been sapped of their water, that there's been a death of cellular integrity based off the absence of water. I'm not trying to take away from the light eaters at all. I'm just saying that if you were going to try to plant life, even in a petri dish, I'm going to keep this out right here. If you were to try to make life on a petri dish naturally or any other, like, is there any other way? It doesn't matter the gender. It doesn't matter the species, literally human, plant, animal. Symbiosis really can't happen unless you've got some type of fluid. Some type of fluid. She's so cute when she sneezes. She's so cute when she sneezes. Bless you. I'm gonna switch decks. We'll just use the plant deck. I'm gonna get 4. I'm gonna get these here. Growth, meditation, breakthrough, and earth. This is the fiery truth. This is the passionate truth. A lot of things came to mind while I was reading that passage. The main meditation point for me really had a lot more to do with adaptation, overcoming the previous definitions, the prior qualifications and the lingual limit that we typically put. Chanterelle coming off with growth. Chanterelle mushroom has a fruity aroma but is noted to have a peppery flavor. Transmutation is kind of like transporting yourself from one mood to another. Here's plantain. More came out with it, but I'm gonna leave those. Okay. Actually, I'm not. This is exactly where we began the reading, was on page 55. Exactly on page 55. We began the reading, A number 1, on page 55. That's what we're meditating on. Here we've got the plantain in reverse. We've got porcini in the middle, another mushroom, and then we've got cucumber. So I can read about these. Plantain was in the reverse. It says useful remedy for coughs and inflammation. You had porcini in the middle. It says the name of porcini means piglets in Italian. So they were talking about vital signs. When I'm talking about vitaling, evolving, vitally enabling self, it's the same survival instinct as plants and animals. Cucumber, the phrase cool as a cucumber refers to its ability to cool your body temperature. Interesting, because that's the other portion of the decision-making process that was discussed here. Let's get one for breakthrough. There's a third 5. Now it's A555. Licorice came out in the reverse. In the upright, its flavor can be used in not only candies, but in soft drinks and herbal teas as well. That's the breakthrough. When you think about the parasites, the bacteria, the viruses, the seedlings that could be preserved in a deep freeze or an ice, the ice cap in Greenland, or I don't know, whichever pole you'd like to choose. That is the preserved, cryogenically placed evolution of water. So if water showed up on a meteor or a comet hurtling through space and time, slammed into this planet, slammed into that part of the world where we now have no clue what's underneath the ice, most likely the fragments of water. Whatever bacteria came here spawned us. It's what created our livelihood. It's what the spermatozoid would call going back to their original state. This is number 6, so this is interesting. We've got 7A5556. This is gooseberry in the reverse. Notable that it does have 3 fruits that are now in the air rather than, hanging. very hard berries that can grow as far as north as the Arctic Circle. There's something about thawing on Earth. I'm telling you, between this licorice breakthrough and the thawing of the Arctic Circle, if we didn't have those 3 states of water, ice, fluid, vapor, there would not be, look, here's the Arjuna plant coming out as the queen at the bottom of the deck. Arjuna plant is most commonly used to help stimulate the heart. That is the heartbeat of the planet. It is the heartbeat of animals and therefore also mammals, full-grown species of mammals like human life. This is what cues life forms to take root, to eat, to gather light, that it also eats. It also eats the information or the knowledge that flows between both sides and translates, transmutes, and transports either via airborne, it's kind of like communicable disease, which is what it said, water droplet, or contact, right? So when we want contact from alien planets or when we want signals to be received, that is in large part why nothing is a coincidence, why and how and where we are a part of everything. There is no differentiation, unfortunately. And I only say unfortunately because I think that's what people have been wanting, is for everyone to be the same. You might just get your wish. You might just get your wish. How lucky are we that we're in the habitable zone as well as the, I'm going to use Nadia Turner deck to just, I'm going to get one here and one there. This and that. Leave it. Right? Leave it be. Whoop. It is. It's the birds and the bees. It's pollination of a nation. This is the Trollfae. Follow the secret signs, as treasures can be found where you least expect them. It did come out in the reverse, but it also came out with seed spells, the green man, the witch hair, as well as the Lady of the Lost. These are all topsy-turvy, and I really just want to. So let me shuffle and then go for each individual. We'll go backwards. We'll go backward. Okay, don't know if you can see that, but that's the way that one wanted to flip out. This is the spiny sister coming out with the earth. Oh, sorry, I said we were going to go backwards. So the truth is the spiny sister. It says, take pride in yourself. And then we've got the Troll Fae coming out again. This was actually the first one that came out before, and it came out both times in the reverse. It says, follow the secret signs as treasures can be found where you least expect them. So we're going to take this in reverse, meaning that if you don't follow it, all I'm going to say is that I always found language interesting in that when you learn a new language, you learn how to communicate with an entire different diaspora of of peoples, right? This says follow the secret signs as treasures can be found where you least expect them. And this is in reverse. So I'll let whoever needs to hear that hear it. And the very top of the read is the North Wood Fae in the upright. Take time for hibernation and healing. Boom, bada, bang.